We're drifting slowly into the timeline of The Last of Us, a quiet and sprawling web of love and ruin that began not with a monster, but with a spore, a thing so small we could never have seen it coming, and yet large enough to unmake the whole of the world we thought we owned. Born in the warm and ordinary days of a late summer in a country that believed itself safe, it grew from a single failed harvest, from a fungus that learned a new way to live, into a silence that swallowed cities whole. But beneath the empty highways, beneath the vines that curled through shattered windows, beneath the soft green glow of the things that had once been men, something more tender lurked. A father who lost a daughter, a girl who could not die the way the others died, a love so fierce it would burn down the future to keep one small life breathing. This is the story of how a mindless thing without malice or memory hollowed out a species, and how the people left behind clinging to one another in the dark learned that the most dangerous infection of all was not the one that grew in the flesh, but the one that grew in the heart, the need to hold on, to keep, to save, no matter the cost. Before we begin, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and stay with me, and let the quiet carry you as we drift back to the very beginning, to a world still whole, still bright, still unaware. There is no hurry here, in the late hours, in the soft dark of the room around you. The story is long, and the story is heavy, but I will carry the weight of it, and you have only to listen, and to breathe, and to let the world you know grow dim, as we walk together back through the years to the first quiet hour, before the walls, before the ration lines, before the dead learn to walk, to a morning as ordinary as any you have ever known. To understand the ending, we must first understand the thing itself, the fungus, older than us, older than nearly everything that walks or crawls. It is called Cordyceps, and it did not begin its long life with any hunger for us. For millions of years it lived in the warm and rotting undergrowth of the tropics, a patient and quiet gardener of death, and its prey were the insects, the ants that marched in their endless lines across the forest floor. A single spore would settle upon a passing ant, drifting down like the softest snow, and it would take root, growing threads of itself, fine as silk, through the small armored body, feeding, spreading, wrapping itself around the tiny knot of nerves that the insect used for a brain. And then the fungus would begin to steer. It would compel the ant to climb up and up, away from its colony, away from the safety of the ground, to a high leaf or a slender stem. And there it would command the small creature to bite down, to lock its jaws in a final and unbreakable grip, and to die. And from the corpse a stalk would rise, blooming from the back of the ant's head, raining new spores upon the colony below, so that the cycle could begin again and again and again. A puppetry so precise, so ancient, that scientists gave it a name that sounds almost like a nightmare spoken aloud. The zombie ant fungus, the maker of the dead who walk. Consider what patience that is, what a long and lightless mastery. The fungus does not know that it is doing any of this. It has no plan, no cunning, no picture in some absent mind of the ant it means to steer. It has only the slow chemistry of growth, refined across 100 million years, until the steering of a living thing became as natural to it as the turning of a root toward water. And in the deep tropics, it found 1,000 hosts, 1,000 kinds of ant and beetle and moth, and for each it grew a slightly different key to fit a slightly different lock, patient, endless, indifferent, a quiet green tyranny holding sway over the small crawling nations of the forest floor, since long before the first of us ever stood upright and looked up at the stars and gave ourselves a name. but it could never touch us. The fungus that hollowed the ants could not survive the warmth of a human body, for our blood runs too hot, and our flesh is a country too high and too fevered for a thing born to the cool damp of the forest floor. For all of our history, this was the wall between us and the horror. A single degree of temperature, a fragile mercy of biology, the only thing that stood between mankind and the puppet strings. And we lived our whole civilization in the shadow of that wall without ever knowing it was there, without ever knowing how thin it was, how easily a wall of warmth might be climbed by something patient enough to learn. And the fungus, we must remember, is patient beyond all understanding. It does not think. It does not want. It has no eyes to see us and no heart to hate us. It only grows and adapts and tries across the long, slow ages, 1,000 tiny failures, until at last one of them is not a failure at all. Perhaps it was the warming of the world that did it, the fevered air, the melting ice, the slow rising of the planet's own temperature that taught the fungus to endure a little more heat, and then a little more. Perhaps it was only chance, the endless dice of nature rolled one time too many. We will never truly know the hour it happened, the quiet mutation in some dim and rotting place, the moment the wall came down. But we know where the door was found. We know the country where the first of us fell. It was in the far reaches of the world, in the fields of a place that grew the grain that fed millions, that the fungus first crossed over. The crops there were treated, sprayed, dusted with the chemicals meant to keep the blight away. And in that treated grain, the fungus found a strange and altered home, and it changed, and it learned. And when the harvest was carried to the mills, and the flour was made, and the bread and the cereal, and 1,000 ordinary foods were baked and boxed and shipped across the seas, the fungus rode along, silent, sleeping, waiting in the very staff of life. And the people ate. They ate their breakfast in their bright kitchens. They ate without a thought, without a single tremor of fear, and the spores that could not once have touched them found at last a warmth they could survive, a body they could climb, a mind they could steer. And so it began, not with a scream, but with a meal, not with a war, but with a morning, ordinary and golden and doomed. Think of how quietly the end must have come, not with a siren, not with a shadow across the sun, but with a spoon, with a slice of toast, with a mother pouring cereal into a child's bowl and telling them to hurry. They would be late. In 1,000 kitchens across 1,000 towns, the seed of the ending was swallowed and never tasted, and the people rose from their tables and went out into their ordinary days, to their work and their errands and their small quarrels, carrying inside them a thing that had waited 100 million years for exactly this, a warmth it could at last endure. A door held open at breakfast, a species that had built its whole vast civilization directly atop the very thing that would undo it, and never once looked down. And there is a further cruelty hidden in the manner of it, a cruelty the story leaves for us to find on our own. The first to fall were not the reckless or the wicked or the unlucky. They were the ones who ate. They were the well-fed, the ordinary, the families gathered around a table with food enough to spare. The very picture of everything the old world had promised us was safe. The plague did not come for the ones who had already lost everything. It came first for the ones who had the most to lose, who woke that morning believing themselves the luckiest people who had ever lived, warm and fed and whole, in a country that had never known a hunger it could not answer. And in the space of a single golden week that country, and every country, learned that there is no wall high enough no army strong enough, no wealth deep enough to keep out a thing that rides in on the bread itself, and that the surest and most ancient comfort we have ever known, the sharing of a meal, the feeding of a child, was the very hand that opened the door and let the ending in. We drift now to a house on a quiet street in a small Texas town on the warmest night of that last ordinary September. Here lived a man named Joel, a builder of houses, a man with rough and capable hands, and here lived his daughter, Sarah, 12 years old, quick to laugh, quick to worry over her father, who worked too hard and slept too little. She had bought him a watch for his birthday, saved her own small money for it, and given it to him with a joke and a smile, and he had worn it, and would wear it for a long, long time after, its face cracked, its hands frozen, a small dead thing he could not bring himself to take off. On that last night, she fell asleep on the couch waiting for him, the television murmuring, the world outside so quiet, so soft, so unaware of the thing that was already moving through the dark, house to house, street to street, a fever spreading faster than any word of warning could travel. It was such a small and gentle life, the one that was about to end. A single father and his daughter, in a modest house, in a town where nothing ever happened. There were dishes in the sink and homework on the table, and a dog somewhere in the neighborhood barking at nothing. Sarah worried after her father the way a child worries after a parent who is all they have, quietly, without quite the words for it, making him coffee, teasing him about his age, filling the small house with the ordinary music of a life that assumes it will simply go on. She did not know, drifting off on the couch with the television light flickering over her face, that this was the last soft evening of the world she knew, that beyond the window the dark was already thickening with sirens too far away to hear, that the ordinary would never come again for anyone, anywhere, and that she had already lived very nearly all the hours she would ever be given. And by the time the sun rose on that last morning, it was already ending. The reports on the television had grown strange, then frightened, then had stopped altogether. In the cities, the sick were filling the hospitals, and then the sick were doing something worse than being sick. They were rising, they were running, they were biting. The infection was not slow. It did not creep across the years as it had crept across the ants. In the warmth of the human body, it burned like a fire in dry grass, taking only a day, sometimes only hours, to travel from the blood to the brain, to snuff out the person and leave the puppet standing in their place. Neighbors turned upon neighbors. The roads clogged with cars that would never move again. And in that small Texas house, a family that had been whole at sunset would not be whole by dawn. We drift now through the longest night of Joel's life, the night the world he knew came apart in his hands. He woke to the phone ringing, to his brother Tommy's voice thin with fear, to the glow of a fire on the far horizon where a neighbor's house was burning. He gathered his daughter, half asleep, frightened, clutching her father's arm, and he ran, out into a night that had become a stranger, past cars that would not start, past people screaming in the dark, past a neighbor they had known for years who came at them now with something wrong in his eyes and something worse in his teeth. They fled in Tommy's truck, through streets choked with the fleeing and the fallen, through a town coming apart at every seam, and Sarah watched from the back seat as the ordinary world she had always known dissolved into fire and shadow, and she was so young, and she was so afraid, and her father could not stop it, could not slow it, could only drive and hold the wheel, and promise her that it would be all right, a promise he could not keep. They crashed. They ran again on foot, Joel carrying Sarah when her hurt leg would not let her run, out of the town and into the dark of the countryside, toward the sound of what they hoped was rescue. Behind them, the town they had lived in all their lives was a wall of fire and screaming, and around them in the dark were shapes that ran too fast and cried out in voices that were almost, but not quite, human. And Joel ran with his child in his arms through the ending of everything, holding to the one small certain thing left in the world, the weight of his daughter against his chest, the sound of her breath, the belief that if he only ran fast enough, held tight enough, he could carry her out the other side of this night and into a morning where it had all been a dream. And they found a soldier, a young man in uniform with a rifle in his hands, and for a moment there was the fragile hope of safety, of order, of someone who would help. But the young soldier had his orders given from far away by frightened men, who believed that the only way to stop the spread was to let no one leave, sick or well, guilty or innocent, and he raised his rifle and he fired. Joel fell shielding his daughter, and when he rose, she was in his arms, and she was hurt in a way that no father's hands could mend. And she looked up at him, and she was frightened, and then she was not frightened anymore, and then she was gone. And Joel knelt in the dirt with his dead child in his arms and made a sound that no soothing word can soften. The sound of a man whose whole reason for waking in the morning has just been taken from the world. This is the wound at the center of everything that follows. Remember it as we drift on. Every hard thing that Joel will ever do, every wall he builds around his heart, every life he takes, grows from this single moment in the dirt, this daughter he could not save. It was not the infected who took her. It was not the mindless fungus, the blind and blameless plague. It was a frightened man with a gun and an order, a human choice, made far away by other frightened men. And that is the first hard truth this story means to teach us, that the fungus opened the door, but it was always people, ordinary people, who did the killing that mattered most. Joel carried that watch, its face cracked in the fall, for 20 years afterward, its hands frozen forever at the hour his daughter died, and he never once set it right, because to move those hands would have been to let the world go on. And Joel, in the deepest and most secret part of himself, had decided that night in the dirt that he would never truly let it. The years fold now, 20 of them, gone in the space of a breath, and the world we drift back into is not the world we left. The great cities of before still stand, but they stand as tombs, their towers gutted and dark, their streets buried under the slow green tide of a nature that has taken back everything we borrowed. The infection ran its course across the whole of the earth in those first terrible months, and where it did not reach, the fear and the hunger and the killing did the rest. Billions are dead. The lights are out. The planes will never fly again. And the survivors, so few, so hardened, have gathered into the last islands of the old order, the quarantine zones, walled cities ruled not by law, as we once knew it, but by the military, by a body that calls itself FEDRA, the last hard fist of a government that no longer truly exists. Drift a while through what the world became. The highways run empty to the horizon, their asphalt cracked and buckled, saplings pushing up through the broken lanes, whole overpasses gone soft with moss. The suburbs stand silent, their windows dark, their lawns grown into meadows, their swimming pools filled with black water and reeds. Deer move through the ruined shopping centres. Wolves den in the lobbies of banks. And everywhere, over everything, the slow, patient green of a world that never needed us, that has already half forgotten we were ever here, drawing its vines up the sides of the towers we thought would stand 1,000 years, pulling our proud and frightened civilization gently back down into the soil. 20 years is nothing to the earth. 20 years is a single held breath. And in that breath, the whole weight of human history, the cities and the machines and the names and the nations, has begun quietly, greenly, to disappear. And there is a strange and terrible comfort woven into that vision, if we are brave enough to look at it in the quiet hours. For the world does not mourn us. The world, freed of us, grows only more beautiful, the rivers running clean again, the great herds returning, the forest climbing back over the wounds we left, the air itself growing sweet in the absence of our smoke. The planet we feared we had ruined forever was only ever waiting for us to step aside, and the moment we did, it began, without a backward glance, to heal. There is grief in that, the grief of knowing how little we truly mattered to the ground beneath our feet, how easily it let us go. But there is a mercy in it too, a vast and impersonal mercy, the knowledge that whatever we did to ourselves, whatever cruelties we visited upon one another in the ruins, the green would go on, the seasons would turn, the giraffes would graze the rooftops in the morning light, and life itself, the same blind, patient life that made the fungus, would continue, indifferent and lovely and unbroken, long after the last human grief had finally, mercifully, fallen silent. Let us drift a while through the streets of one such zone, the city of Boston, 20 years after the fall. Behind its high walls the people live, if it can be called living, in the crumbling shells of old apartments, their windows boarded, their days measured out in ration cards and checkpoints, and the long, grey labour of survival. FEDRA keeps them alive, and FEDRA keeps them afraid. There is bread, of a kind. There is electricity, sometimes, for an hour or two. And there is the constant watchful presence of the soldiers, who will hang a smuggler in the public square, who will drag away anyone who shows the smallest sign of a cough or a fever, who test the whole population and mark the infected for the pits where the dead are burned. It is order bought with cruelty, safety bought with freedom, and the people who live under it have grown numb to the price. They keep their heads down. They trade in the shadows. They learn not to hope too loudly. Walk with me through a morning in the zone. The ration line forms before dawn, a grey river of the hungry, coats worn thin, faces closed and careful. A loudspeaker somewhere recites the rules that never change, the curfew, the penalties, the reminder that this is for your protection. Children are born here who have never seen a field, never tasted fresh fruit, never known a night without a wall around it. The old remember, and the old are careful never to say what they remember. For hope in a place like this is a kind of sickness, a thing that gets you noticed, gets you hanged. And over it all the soldiers watch from their towers, bored and armed and certain, the inheritors of a world they did not make and cannot mend, keeping the last lights burning with the only tools they have left, which are fear and the gun and the wall. For a mindless order breeds its opposite, and in the alleys and the ruins beyond FEDRA's reach, there grew a resistance, a scattered band of rebels who called themselves the Fireflies. They had once been idealists, men and women who dreamed of tearing down the military rule and giving the survivors back their voices, their votes, their lives. Their slogan was whispered on the walls in fading paint, a small and stubborn ember of hope. Look for the light, they wrote. When you're lost in the dark, look for the light. But 20 years of war had worn them down, hardened them, hollowed some of them out, until the line between the freedom fighter and the terrorist had grown thin and grey. They bombed, they killed, they died in the streets and in the FEDRA cells, and yet they held still to one great dream above all the others, the dream that had begun to seem more like a prayer, the dream of a cure. There is a particular sorrow to the Fireflies, and we will return to it before the end, for they are the story's great study in what happens to a good cause left too long in the dark. They began as the best of the survivors, the ones who could not accept that a boot on the neck was the most that humanity could hope for. They dreamed of the world before, of elections and free cities, and the right of a people to choose. But a dream cannot eat, and a dream cannot fight an army, and so the Fireflies learned to do the hard things, the bombings, the reprisals, the killings that could always be justified by the size of the dream they served. And year by year the dream grew smaller, and the killings grew larger, until many who had once painted the light upon the walls looked at their own bloodied hands and could no longer quite remember the difference between what they were fighting and what they had become. And it is here, in this grey and guttering city, that we find Joel again, 20 years older, 20 years harder, a man made of scar tissue and silence. The father who wept in the dirt is gone, buried so deep that even he can no longer find him. In his place is a smuggler, a man who moves contraband through the broken walls of the zone, who works the black markets, who does what must be done and asks no questions and lets no one close. He has a partner now, a woman named Tess, as sharp and as scarred as he is, and between them there is not quite love but something like it, a hard and wary trust, two survivors leaning back to back against a world that wants them dead. He does not speak of Sarah. He does not speak of much at all. He has learned the one lesson the new world teaches above all others, that to care for someone is to hand the world a knife to hold against your throat. And Joel has decided, somewhere in those 20 grey years, that he will never hand over that knife again. He is wrong, of course. We know he is wrong, but he does not know it yet, and so we drift on, toward the girl who will teach him. We should linger a moment on what the 20 years did to him, for it is the quiet engine of everything to come. Joel survived, and survival cost him nearly everything a man can pay and still walk. There were hard years we are only ever shown in glimpses, years of doing terrible things to stay alive, of being, by his own later admission, the kind of man he would once have run from. He ambushed travellers. He took what he needed. He learned to feel very little, because to feel much was to be slowed, and to be slowed was to die. And so, the warm and worried father from the Texas house was pressed down under layer after layer of scar, until what remained on the surface was a hard and useful man who could carry anything, endure anything, and love nothing, because loving was the one thing that had ever truly broken him, and he did not intend to be broken twice. Let us drift now to the girl, for every story of ruin must have somewhere in its heart a small and stubborn light. Her name is Ellie, and she is 14 years old, and she has never known the world that was. She was born after the fall, into the walls and the checkpoints and the ration lines, and to her the ruined world is simply the world, the only one there is. She has never seen the ocean, never ridden an escalator, never eaten an ice cream that was not a story told by someone older. She has grown up in a FEDRA military school, taught to shoot, taught to fight, raised on discipline and hunger, and she has become sharp and profane and quick, a child armoured in jokes because jokes are the only armour a child can afford. She reads old comic books by candlelight, She hums old songs she half remembers. She is angry and she is curious, and she is achingly, secretly lonely, and she is carrying inside her small body the single most important thing left alive on the earth, though she does not yet fully understand what it means. For Ellie is immune. The infection took root in her body, and then, impossibly, it stopped, held back by something in her blood that no one could name, a fluke, a miracle, a mutation, a mercy. She waited to die, and she did not die. And she has carried the guilt of that survival ever since, the terrible weight of being the one who lived. But she has carried too the small hard knowledge that she is different, that she is proof, that in her veins runs the answer that the whole broken world has been dying to find. There is a fierceness in her that the walls could not grind down, a refusal, a spark. Where Joel has learned to want nothing, Ellie wants everything, wants to see the world, wants it to mean something, wants, most of all and most secretly, for someone to stay. She does not yet know how much it will cost her, the wanting. In this world, the wanting is always the wound. Let us drift a while into the small hidden story that shaped the girl before ever Joel knew her name, for she did not come to the road unmarked. Before the road, before Joel, there had been a friend, Riley, a girl a little older, a little wilder, the first person Ellie had ever loved in the aching, uncertain way that the young come to love. Riley had run off to join the Fireflies, drawn by their promise of something more than the grey obedience of the zone. And one night, before she was to be sent away to a distant post, she came back for Ellie and stole her out past the curfew and took her to a place of wonder, an old shopping mall, dark and abandoned and forbidden, a ruin of the world before. And for one night, one single stolen night, the two girls were simply girls, riding the dead escalators, playing the silent arcade machines that Riley coaxed back to a flickering life, trying on masks in an old costume shop, dancing together in the dark to music from a music box, laughing, free, alive, tasting for a few brief hours the ordinary joy that the ruined world had promised they would never know. It was the happiest night of Ellie's young life, and it was the last of its kind, for the infected found them there in the dark, and in the fighting both girls were bitten, and there, in that ruined mall, the two of them faced together the certainty of what was coming. They chose not to die alone, and not to end themselves, but to wait, to be together for whatever hours were left, to let the fungus take them side by side rather than face the dark apart. But the fungus took only Riley, and Ellie, waiting to turn, waiting to become a monster beside her friend, did not turn, and had to watch the person she loved most in the world become one of the running dead, and carry from that ruined mall the twin wounds that would shape her forever, the immunity that made her precious, and the guilt of the one who is left behind. It is Marlene who finds her, Marlene the leader of the Fireflies, a woman worn thin by a lifetime of war and loss, who had known Ellie's mother long ago and made a promise over her that she meant to keep. Marlene understood at once what the girl was, understood that Ellie's immunity might be the thread from which a cure could be woven, if only she could be carried safe to the Firefly scientists, to a laboratory far away in the West, where the last true researchers of the old world still labored over the puzzle of the plague. But Boston was closing around the Fireflies like a fist. FEDRA was hunting them. Marlene was wounded, her people scattered and dying, and she could not make the journey herself. And so she turned, in her desperation, to a pair of smugglers she knew only by reputation, hard and reliable, people who moved cargo through the walls and did not ask what the cargo was. She turned to Tess, She turned to Joel. And so the bargain was struck, in the grey light of a ruined room. The bargain that would set everything in motion. The Fireflies had a cache of weapons that Joel and Tess needed. Marlene had a girl who needed to be delivered. Carry her out of the city, Marlene said. Carry her to a group of Fireflies waiting beyond the walls, and the weapons are yours. It seemed a simple thing, a job like any other, cargo to be moved from one place to another. Joel looked at the girl, this sullen and watchful child, and felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing, and agreed. He did not know. He could not have known. He looked at Ellie and saw a package, a task, a means to an end, and he could not see the road that stretched ahead of them, the seasons they would cross together, the 1,000 miles and the 1,000 dangers, and he could not see, most of all, that he was looking at the thing that would break open the tomb he had made of his own heart and let the light back in, whether he wished it or not. They left the city in the dead of night, the three of them, out through a hidden passage in the wall and into the ruins beyond, and almost at once the simple job began to come apart. There were soldiers. There was a checkpoint, a scanner, a test for infection, and when the device was pressed to Ellie, it did not read her as clean, and it did not read her as she should have read, and in the sudden violence that followed, a FEDRA man lay dead, and there could be no turning back. Out into the drowned and broken bones of old Boston they went, past buildings sunk in standing water, past the first of the infected shambling in the dark, and Joel began to understand that this girl was no ordinary cargo. He saw the truth of her when they were cornered, when the infected came, when Ellie, without hesitation, took up a blade and drove it into the thing that was lunging for Joel's throat, saving the life of the man who had barely spoken to her. And he saw, when the fight was done, that she carried no fear of the infected the way the rest of them did, and slowly, piece by piece, the impossible truth came clear. The girl was bitten. The bite was old, weeks old, and she was not dead, and she was not turned, and she was not sick. The girl was immune. But the road takes its first great toll early, as if to teach us that nothing in this world comes without a price. When they reached the meeting place, the Fireflies they had come to find were all dead, killed in some skirmish, their bodies cooling in the ruin. And Tess, sharp and hard and unbreakable Tess, was found in that same moment to be hurt, and worse than hurt. She had been bitten in the fighting, and she was not like Ellie. She was not immune, and she could feel already the fungus beginning its slow, cold climb through her blood. She knew what was coming. She had seen it 100 times. And in the last clear hour left to her, she did a thing that surprised even herself. She chose to believe that the girl was worth it, that the cure was real, that this once the dying might mean something. Take her, Tess told Joel. Take her west, finish it, make it matter. And she stayed behind, alone, to hold the soldiers who were coming, to buy the two of them the minutes they needed to run. Joel did not want to leave her, but she made him. And as they fled into the ruins, they heard the gunfire behind them, and then they heard it stop, and Tess was gone, the first of the many that Ellie would watch die on the long road west, the first of the many that Joel would carry, silent, in the growing weight of his heart. Let us pause here, in the quiet between one danger and the next, and drift a while into the nature of the infected themselves. For the fungus does not make one kind of monster, but many, and each is a chapter in a slow and terrible unmaking, a story of a single body dying by inches across long and lightless years. When first the spores take hold, when the bite or the breath carries the fungus into the blood, the person we knew is not at once erased, For a day, perhaps two, the fever climbs and the mind unravels, and then the thing that rises is called a runner, and a runner is the most heartbreaking of them all, for it still wears the face of the one it was. It still weeps. It still moans in something that sounds almost like grief. Its eyes are clouded, but its shape is human, and it runs, fast and frenzied and full of a borrowed rage, hurling itself at the living with a hunger that is not its own, but the fungus speaking through it, the plague using the last of a person's strength to make more of itself. To kill a runner is to kill someone only just departed, someone whose family might still remember their laugh, whose clothes are the clothes they chose that morning, whose face, beneath the clouding of the eyes, is a face that a mother or a child would still know in a crowd. That is the first cruelty of the infected, that at the beginning they are so nearly still us, that in the frantic dark of a fight, it is impossible not to see, in the thing that lunges at you, the person it so recently was, the barber, the teacher, the child, the friend. The survivors learn to kill them fast, and not to look at the faces, for to look at the faces is to be undone, and this small habit, this refusal to see, is one more little death that the fungus works upon the living, teaching them to strike at what still looks like a human being and feel nothing, because feeling is a thing this world can no longer afford. And we should pause, in this quiet, on the terrible question the runner asks and can never answer, the question of whether anything at all remains inside. Is the person truly gone in that first day, snuffed out clean, so that what runs and bites is only meat and fungus wearing a stolen shape? Or is some small trapped remnant of them still there, buried under the growth, watching from behind the clouded eyes, screaming in a voice that cannot reach the surface, made to run and made to bite against a will that no longer has any hand upon its own body? The story never tells us. It only shows us the weeping, the moaning that sounds so much like grief, and lets the doubt work upon us the way it works upon the survivors, who can never quite be sure, when they raise the blade, whether they are granting a mercy or committing a murder, whether the thing before them is a monster to be put down or a person to be saved, and who learn, in the end, that in this world the two are so often the very same, and that the kindest thing and the most terrible thing are frequently the single motion of the same tired hand. And then the years work upon them, those that are not killed, that find some dark and quiet place to shelter, a flooded basement, a collapsed subway, a sunless ruin, begin slowly to change as the fungus deepens its roots and remakes the body to suit its purpose. After a year, perhaps more, the runner becomes a stalker, a thing caught between two states, its skin beginning to split with the first pale growths of fungus, its movements grown cunning and quiet. The stalker does not charge blindly as the runner does. It hides. It waits in the dark corners and the shattered doorways, still and patient, and it lunges only when the living draw near, a predator learning the arts of ambush, even as its own flesh is consumed. It is the fungus growing wiser, the plague learning to hunt, and to walk past a stalker in the dark, not knowing if the shape against the wall is a corpse or awaiting death, is to know a particular and breathless kind of fear. For the stalker keeps just enough of the body's old cleverness, the old animal knowledge of shadows and silences, and lends it to the fungus's blind and patient hunger, so that the thing waiting in the dark is neither wholly mindless nor anything you could call a mind, only a readiness, a stillness, a coiled and rotting patience that has learned that the living make noise, and that noise, if you only wait for it, always comes. Deeper still into the years the change goes on, and the person is buried now beneath the fungus entirely, the growth spreading up over the face, blooming outward in hard pale plates, and at last the eyes are covered over completely, swallowed, gone, and the thing that remains is blind. This is the clicker, and it is the true face of the horror, for it has lost the last trace of what it was. Its head is a grotesque flower of fungal bloom, its features drowned beneath the growth, and having lost its eyes, it has gained instead a terrible gift. It sees the world through sound, sending out sharp and rattling clicks that return to it the shape of everything near, a monstrous echo by which it maps the dark. A clicker cannot see you standing before it, but let a floorboard creak, let a breath come too loud, and it will turn, and it will find you, and it is strong beyond the strength of any living person, and its bite is death. To move past a clicker, one must move as the dead move, silent, holding the breath, for the smallest sound in that clicking dark is an invitation to a merciless end. And there is a particular horror in the clicker's blindness, in the way it has traded its human face and its human eyes for a thing so wholly given over to the fungus that nothing at all remains, no flicker of the person, no last trace of a soul, only the rattling clicks echoing off the wet stone, only the hunger mapping the dark, waiting for the one small sound that will bring it down upon you. It is the plague fully arrived, the person fully departed, the puppet with its strings drawn so tight that the hand that once wore it has rotted entirely away. And there is worse yet, at the very end of the long unmaking, for those infected who survived the years beyond all counting, a decade or more of feeding and growing in the deepest and darkest places. The fungus swells them, armors them, layers them in thick plates of hardened growth and ripe pockets of spores until they are barely human in shape at all, vast and lumbering and swollen with rot. This is the bloater, the eldest of the infected, so wrapped in fungus that ordinary weapons scarcely wound it, and when it draws near, it tears loose handfuls of its own toxic flesh and hurls them, bursting clouds of spores that choke and blind and kill. It moves slowly, ponderously, but it does not need to be quick, for it is a walking fortress of disease, and to face one in the narrow dark of a ruin is to face a thing that was once a person, and is now almost a landscape of the plague, a monument to how far and how completely the fungus can hollow out a human life. And through all of these stages, we must remember, runs a single unbroken thread, for the Cordyceps binds them together underground, root to root and stalk to stalk, so that in the deepest ruins the infected are not many creatures at all but one, a single spreading organism wearing 1,000 stolen faces, listening through 1,000 ruined ears, dreaming, if it dreams at all, one long green dream of endless growth. Disturb it in one place and it wakes in another. Kill a body here, and the vast pale network beneath the floors shudders and sends more. There is no leader to be found, no heart to be pierced, no mind to be reasoned with or broken. Only the growth, only the reaching, only the patient green tide that does not know it is a monster, because it does not know anything at all. And there is a grim poetry in the shape of it, this long ladder of the infected, the runner and the stalker and the clicker and the bloater, for it is not 4 monsters, but one, the same person at 4 ages of their dying, a single human being followed all the way down into the dark. The runner is the newly dead, still warm with the memory of who they were. The stalker is the cunning that outlives the self. The clicker is the face erased entirely, the soul drowned, the eyes given up for a way of seeing that belongs wholly to the fungus. And the bloater is the end of the road, the body become a landscape, the person become a place. To walk through a ruin thick with the infected is to walk through a single life toll backward and forward at once, to pass a thing that still weeps, and a thing that has forgotten weeping, and a thing that has forgotten it ever had a face, and to understand that this is not an invasion by some alien horror, but a slow and patient transformation of ourselves into the soil, a demonstration written in stolen flesh of exactly how little stands between the person we love and the pale, blind growth that will one day, given time enough, be all that is left of any of us. Now let us drift back to the road, to Joel and Ellie, making their slow way out of the drowned edges of Boston and into the overgrown country beyond, toward a man Joel knew of old, a man who might have a working vehicle to speed them west. His name was Bill, and he lived alone in a small, emptied town that he had made into a fortress of his own paranoid design, a place strung with traps and tripwires and alarms, every road mined, every fence hung with warnings, a whole town turned into the shell of one frightened and grieving man. Bill was hard and rude and suspicious of everyone, a survivor who had decided long ago that other people were only wounds waiting to be inflicted, and he wanted nothing to do with Joel's girl or Joel's errand. But he owed Joel a debt, and grudgingly, complaining at every step, he agreed to help them find a car. There is a whole small philosophy in Bill, a way of surviving the end of the world that the story sets before us like a warning. Bill had looked at the ruins and drawn the coldest and most logical of conclusions, that other people are the true danger, that every bond is a liability, that the man who loves nothing can lose nothing, and so he had walled himself in, mined his roads, hung his fences with warnings, and made of his whole town a fortress against the one thing more dangerous to him than any clicker, which was another human heart. And by the cold arithmetic of survival, he was right. He was alive. He was fed. He was safe behind his walls. He was also, we come to see, already dead in every way that the word matters. A man who had traded his whole soul for the mere continuance of his body, and who sat now alone in his fortress with nothing to protect but the emptiness he had so carefully built. And in Bill's town, beneath all his bluster, there lived a quiet grief that told, in miniature, the whole sorrow of this world. For Bill had not always been alone. There had been another man, a partner named Frank, who had lived with him in that fortified town, who had loved Bill and been loved by him in whatever hard and unspoken way two such men could manage at the end of the world. But Frank had grown weary of Bill's fear, weary of living behind so many walls, and he had left, and in his leaving he had been bitten, and rather than turn, rather than become one of the shambling dead, he had chosen his own end, and left behind a note thick with all the bitterness and all the love that he had never quite been able to say aloud. Joel and Ellie found the note. They found what was left of Frank, and Bill, who pretended not to care, cared more than he could bear, and we understand, watching him, that even here, even in this man who had shut out the whole world, the terrible, tender infection of love had found its way in, and left its wound, as it does in all of us, as it will do, most of all, in Joel. With a car at last, coughing and rattling but alive, they drove west out of the ruins of Massachusetts, and Joel began, without quite meaning to, without ever admitting it, to soften toward the girl at his side. She talked without end, filling the long silences he had grown so used to, asking questions about the world before, marveling at the smallest ruins of it. An old cassette tape, a faded billboard, a joke book she carried that she read aloud in the dark to make him almost smile. And Joel, who had spoken to no one of his heart in 20 years, found the walls he had built around it beginning, brick by reluctant brick, to loosen. He did not want this. He knew what caring cost. He had paid that price once in the dirt of a Texas roadside and sworn never to pay it again. But the girl was funny, and the girl was brave, and the girl was alone in the world as he was alone, and the road was long, and the heart, whatever we tell it, will do what it will do. There is a tenderness to these middle miles that the story never lets us keep, and perhaps that is why it lingers on them so. The small jokes, the old songs on a found guitar, the wonder in the girl's face at a herd of something wild, at the ocean she had never seen, at the ordinary marvels of a world she had only ever heard described. Joel watched her wonder and remembered, though he would never say it, another child, another set of small delights, and something in him that he had believed frozen forever began, against his will, to thaw. This is how it happens, the story tells us, gently, in the long spaces between the horrors. Not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones, in the accumulating weight of shared danger and shared silence and shared jokes told in the dark, until one day a man who wanted nothing looks over at the person beside him and understands, with something close to terror, that he would now do anything at all, to keep them. But the road west did not lead to safety. It led to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh was a lesson in the darkest truth of this broken world, that the infected are not the worst of what walks in it. Their car was ambushed on the highway, run into a trap by a man who feigned a wounded need for help, and Joel and Ellie found themselves fighting not the mindless dead, but the living. A pack of desperate and violent survivors who had turned their ruined city into a hunting ground. These were the hunters, men and women, who had thrown off FEDRA and the Fireflies alike, and made themselves into predators of their own kind, luring travelers into ambushes, killing them for their supplies, their weapons, their boots, their bullets, for the whole grim currency of survival. In the world of The Last of Us, we learn again and again, the fungus took the future, but it was people, ordinary frightened people, who filled the ruins with the greater share of the blood. The hunters are worth dwelling on, for they are the story's plainest statement of its darkest theme, that the fungus was only ever the smaller monster. These were not infected, not puppets, not mindless things driven by a growth they could not resist. These were people, whole and thinking, who had looked at the ruined world and chosen this, chosen to lure the desperate with cries for help, to kill them for their boots and their bullets, to make of their own city a trap baited with human kindness. The fungus at least does not know what it does. The fungus feels no cruelty, takes no pleasure, keeps no tally. But the hunters chose every day with open eyes to be what they were. And in choosing, they proved the thing the story returns to again and again, that when the walls came down and the lights went out, the horror that crawled up out of the wreckage to fill the empty world was not the fungus at all, but us, our fear, our appetite, our endless gift for finding reasons to do to one another the very worst that can be done. And here, in the crucible of Pittsburgh, Ellie killed her first living man, took up a pistol and fired it to save Joel's life, and Joel saw the horror of it settle over her young face, the knowledge that she too was now a taker of lives, another innocence spent to the hungry road. It is a moment the story means us to feel as a small death of its own, for there is a line a person crosses once that they can never uncross, and Ellie crossed it here, in the dark of a ruined city, at 14, to save the man who had barely, until now, allowed himself to care for her. She did what she had to do. She would do it again and again, and each time a little of the girl from the mall, the girl who danced in the dark, would go out of her, spent to keep the two of them breathing, until by the end of the long road, there would be so little of that girl left that even she would struggle to find her. It was in that same ruined city that they met Henry and Sam, two brothers fleeing the same hunters, and for a little while the four of them travelled together, a small and fragile fellowship in the dark. Henry was the elder, hard and careful, worn down by the weight of keeping his younger brother alive, and Sam was younger even than Ellie, a quiet and frightened boy who carried a small toy robot and dreamed, in the way that children do, of a world with less to fear in it. Ellie and Sam became friends in the swift and total way that only children can, and for a handful of hours there was something like hope among them, the four survivors making their way toward the promise of safety, laughing a little, resting a little, daring for a moment to imagine a future. But this world does not suffer such moments long, for Sam had been bitten in the fighting and had hidden it out of fear, out of shame, out of the child's desperate hope that if he did not say it aloud, it might not be true. And in the grey light of morning the fungus took him, and the small frightened boy became one of the running dead, and Henry, in a single unbearable instant, was forced to raise his gun against the brother he had spent his whole life protecting, and having done it, could not bear to go on living himself, and so followed his brother into the dark. Ellie stood over the two graves in silence, and something in her hardened, and something in her broke, and Joel had no words to give her, for there were none, there are none, for a grief so early and so complete. She was learning too young the lesson the whole story teaches, that in this world to love is to be handed a knife, and that sooner or later the world always finds a way to make you feel its edge. They pressed on, west and ever west, and the seasons turned around them, the green heat of summer fading into the gold and rust of autumn, the leaves falling, the air growing sharp, the light growing thin. They rode on together into the failing autumn, following directions toward a university in the east of Wyoming, a place where the Fireflies had once kept a laboratory, where the scientists who might use Ellie's blood were said to gather. The campus, when they reached it, was silent and overgrown, its halls choked with vine and shadow, its promise long since fled, for the Fireflies had abandoned it and moved on to some new sanctuary far in the west, in a place called Salt Lake City. But the empty campus held one more cruelty in store. As they searched its ruins, they were set upon by hunters, and in the desperate fighting that followed, Joel fell, was thrown from a height onto a spar of broken metal that ran him through, and though he killed the men who had come for them, he could not undo the wound in his own side. They fled into the wilderness on a stolen horse, Joel bleeding, greying, fading, and for the first time in the whole long journey, the strong one was not strong, the protector could not protect, and the roles that had carried them so far were turned entirely around. The girl who had been the cargo, the burden, the thing to be moved, became now the only thing standing between Joel and the dark, and she took up that weight without a word, because somewhere on the long road he had stopped being her keeper and become her family, and family, in whatever ruin, is the one thing you do not put down. Somewhere in Wyoming, in the high cold country near the mountains, Joel had a purpose beyond the girl, for his brother Tommy lived there, or had once, and Tommy had been a Firefly, and might know the way to the scientists Marlene had spoken of. They found Tommy at last at a great dam that he and a small community of survivors had brought back to life. a place of running water and working lights and growing crops. A settlement that had made itself into something almost like a town from the world before. A fragile proof that people could still build as well as burn. Tommy had left the Fireflies and their war behind. He had found a wife, a home, a reason to hope, and he wanted no part of Joel's hard errand. For Tommy had walked a long and different road from Joel's. He had ridden with the Fireflies in the early years, believing, as the young believe, that the world could be saved by the right cause and the right courage, and he had watched that belief bleed out of him a little more with every friend he buried, until at last he could no longer tell the righteous killing from the ordinary kind, and he laid down the banner and walked away to find something worth building rather than something worth dying for. He found it at that great hydroelectric dam, a dam that still, against all odds, could be made to turn, to catch the falling water and spin it into light. And around that light he and a small band of the weary gathered and began to build. And here Joel, for the first and only time on the whole long road, tried to give the girl away, for he had felt the walls of his heart falling, felt the old wound of Sarah tearing open, felt the unbearable terror of loving something in a world so eager to take it, and in his fear he asked Tommy to carry Ellie the rest of the way west, to be the one to risk his heart, so that Joel would not have to risk his own. Ellie overheard. She understood, and that night she ran, furious and wounded, out into the dark, for she had come to believe, in her lonely way, that Joel was hers as she was his, that they belonged to one another now, and to be handed off like cargo, after everything, after Tess and Sam and all the miles of blood, was a wound as deep as any bite. Joel went after her. He found her. And in the finding, something in him gave way at last, the last brick of the last wall, and he chose her, chose to keep her, chose to carry her himself the rest of the way, whatever it cost, whatever it woke in him. And though neither of them said the word, from that night on they were, in every way that the ruined world still allowed, a father and a daughter once again. And so we drift into winter, the hardest season, the season of white silence and long nights and cold that gets into the bone. Joel lay near death in the shelter of an abandoned town, drifting in and out of a fevered dark, and Ellie, 14 years old, alone in the frozen world, became the keeper of them both. She hunted for their food. She tended his terrible wound. She fought off the infected and the cold and the gnawing fear that the one person left to her in all the world was slipping away beneath her hands. The child who had been carried was now the one who carried, and she did it without complaint, with a fierce and desperate love, because she had lost everyone else and she could not lose him too. It is here, in the deep of that winter, that we see most clearly what has grown between them, that the errand has become a family, that the cargo has become a daughter, and that Ellie, who has watched so many people die on the road behind her, has decided in her stubborn heart that this one death she will not allow. She ranges out alone into the snow-choked woods with a rifle and a bow, a small figure against the great white silence, hunting, listening, surviving, growing colder and harder and more alone with every day that Joel lies fevered and helpless in the dark. She is learning, in that winter, that she can carry it, all of it, the fear and the killing and the weight of another life, and it is a terrible thing to have to learn so young, and it will mark her, that knowledge, that she is strong enough to survive anything, even, in the end, the loss of the very thing she is trying so hard to save. But winter brings its own predators, and hunting for food in the frozen woods, Ellie crossed the path of a group of survivors, led by a soft-spoken man, named David. He seemed at first a shepherd of his people, calm and kind and reasonable, a man who spoke of faith and community and offered medicine for Joel's wound in exchange for a little trust. But beneath the gentle surface of David, there lurked something rotten beyond the reach of any fungus, for his community survived the winter by the darkest means of all, by hunting other people, by butchering the travelers they caught and feeding on them. Cannibals dressed in the language of family and faith. And David had taken a particular and terrible interest in Ellie, in her strength, in her spirit, wanting to keep her, to break her, to bend her to himself. And when she would not be kept, his gentle mask fell away entirely, and the monster beneath was revealed. What followed was the darkest hour of Ellie's young life. Hunted through a burning town by men who meant to eat her. Cornered at last by David in a room full of fire and smoke. And Ellie, who had been so many times the one to be saved, saved herself, in a fury of terror and rage, striking again and again until the man who had hunted her lay dead beneath her hands. When Joel found her, dragged up from his own deathbed by a father's desperate strength, he found not the child he had left, but someone changed, someone who had passed through a fire and come out marked by it forever. He took her in his arms and called her by the name he had never dared to use, called her baby girl, the name that had belonged once to Sarah, the name he had buried with his daughter in the Texas dirt. And in speaking it, he closed at last the 20-year circle of his grief, and gave to Ellie the whole of the heart he had sworn never to give again. And Ellie, who had been so alone, let herself be held, and for a moment in all that cold and horror there was warmth. There was the fragile, impossible mercy of two broken people who had found, against every odd, a family in the ruins. Spring came, as spring always comes, even to the end of the world. The snow melted from the mountains, and the road opened again before them. And Joel and Ellie, healed as much as such people ever heal, made the last of their long journey west, toward Salt Lake City, toward the Fireflies, toward the laboratory, where Ellie's blood might at last be made into the cure that the whole dying world had prayed for. And on the way, in a moment of rare and simple peace, they crested a hill and saw below them a herd of wild giraffes moving through the ruins of a city, great and gentle creatures grazing on the rooftops where the vines grew thick, and the two of them stood together and watched in wonder. And for a moment the plague and the blood and the long, hard road all fell away, and there was only the beauty of a world going on without us, indifferent and lovely and green. It is the last easy breath of the whole story, that moment on the hill. Remember it, hold it, for everything after is the reckoning, and the reckoning, when it comes, will ask a question that has no gentle answer. There is a reason the story gives us the giraffes, the great slow harmless creatures moving through the wreckage of our world, untroubled, unafraid, grazing on the towers we built and abandoned. They are the world without us, the world that does not miss us, the green and gentle future that has no need of humankind at all. And for one bright moment, Ellie and Joel stand together and look at that future and are simply, wholly happy, two people who love each other, at rest, at peace, in the sun, and the story lets them have it. This one moment because it knows, and we are about to learn, that it is the last one they will ever be given. They reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City in the wet green of spring, and there, at the very threshold of everything they had suffered to reach, the Fireflies found them and took them. And here at last is the heart of the whole matter, the wound around which the entire story turns. For when Joel woke, He woke in a hospital bed in the Firefly stronghold, and Marlene was there, Marlene who had begun it all. And she told him the truth of what was about to happen, the truth that the fungus, the immunity, the cure, had been building toward all along. The doctors had examined Ellie. They believed that the Cordyceps had grown differently inside her, that it had woven itself through her mind since her infection as a child, and that from that growth, from the fungus in her brain, they might learn to make a medicine, a vaccine, a way to give the rest of humanity the mercy that her body had been given by chance. But the fungus was in her brain. To reach it, to study it, to harvest from it the cure, they would have to open her skull. They would have to take from her the one thing that could not be given back. To make the cure, the girl would have to die. And here the story plants the quiet doubt that will haunt every argument about it for as long as it is remembered. The doubt of whether the cure was ever truly possible at all. For the Fireflies were desperate, and the Fireflies were dying, and a movement that has bled for 20 years toward a single distant hope will believe, when that hope at last lies unconscious on a table before it, very nearly anything. Perhaps the doctors were right, and Ellie's death would have bought a vaccine, a mercy, a way home for the whole of the species. Or perhaps it would have bought only a dead child and a failed experiment. One more small grave among billions, the last flickering self-deception of the last true believers in a cause already lost. We are never told. The story withholds the certainty on purpose, because it does not want us to be able to do the math cleanly, does not want us to be able to say the girl for the world and have the sum come out neat. It wants us to stand exactly where Joel stood, in a corridor, with the truth uncertain and the blade already raised, and to feel how little the arithmetic matters when the girl on the table is one you love. And Ellie did not even know. She was already being prepared, already unconscious, already laid out beneath the surgeon's lights. And no one had asked her, no one had woken her to say the words, "This is what your life will buy. Is this a price you choose to pay?" Perhaps she would have said yes. Perhaps, carrying all her guilt at surviving when Riley and Sam and so many others had died, she would have given herself gladly, would have wanted her life to mean this one enormous thing, to be the death that finally ended all the dying. We will never know, because they never asked her. And Joel, waking to the news that the girl he had come to love as his own daughter was about to be killed on a table down the hall, did not ask her either. He made the choice for her, the only choice his broken heart could make, the choice of a father who had already buried one daughter and would not, could not, would rather burn the whole world down than bury another. And so Joel did a terrible thing, and it is terrible precisely because we understand it so completely. He took up his gun, and he went through the hospital, room by room and man by man, and he killed the Fireflies, killed the guards, killed the last soldiers of the last movement that had ever dreamed of saving the world. He reached the operating room, and he killed the surgeon who stood over Ellie with the blade already in his hand, and he lifted her, still senseless, from the table, and he carried her out, carried her the way he had carried Sarah down a Texas road 20 years before, and this time, he would not let her be taken. And in the parking garage below, Marlene stepped into his path. Marlene, who had loved Ellie too, who had made a promise over the girl's mother long ago, and she pleaded with him, told him it was what Ellie would have wanted, told him he was stealing not just a life but the future of everyone left alive. And Joel raised his gun and killed her too. Killed her so that she could never come looking, never try again to take his daughter to a table and a blade. It was the most selfish thing a man could do, and the most human. The whole vast dying world traded away for one small life, one girl, one heart he could not bear to lose. And we, drifting above it, cannot even condemn him, for we have walked the whole long road at his side. We have felt the walls of his heart fall brick by brick, and we know that we, in his place, might have done the very same, might have carried the girl out into the light and let the world go dark, because the world is an abstraction, and the girl is real and warm and ours. And then he lied to her. When Ellie woke in the truck, groggy and confused, asking what had happened, why they had left, whether the doctors had found what they needed, Joel looked at her, this girl who had crossed a continent believing her life might buy a cure, and he told her that it had all been for nothing. He told her there were others like her, others who were immune, that the doctors had tried and failed and given up, that there was no cure to be made and never had been, and that the Fireflies had simply stopped looking. It was a lie built to protect her, to let her live without the crushing weight of knowing what her survival had cost, to let her go on believing that her long journey had simply ended, rather than that a father had drowned the hope of the world to keep her breathing. And Ellie, in the last moment of the first great chapter of this story, looked at him and asked him to swear that what he had told her was true. "Swear to me," she said. "Swear that everything you said about the Fireflies is true." And Joel looked her in the eye, and he said, "I swear." And Ellie, after a long and terrible pause, a pause in which perhaps she already half suspected, perhaps she already knew, said only, "Okay." And on that single fragile word, that lie accepted, that trust half broken and half held, the first great movement of the story closes. A father and a daughter alive together in a world neither of them can any longer quite believe in, carrying between them a secret that will one day, we sense, come due. For a lie is a seed like any other, and this one was planted in the deepest soil there is, in the love between the two of them, and it would grow quietly in the dark across all the years to come, until at last it broke the surface and bore its bitter fruit. Let us drift back now before we go on, and dwell a while in the wider dark, in the long, slow dying of the old world, for the fall of Joel's family was only one small candle going out among billions. And to understand the ruins the road runs through, we must understand how the ruins were made. In those first weeks after the outbreak, in that last golden September, the world did not so much fight the plague as drown beneath it, for the infection moved faster than any warning, faster than any wall could be built, faster than the frightened governments could even understand what was happening to them. The cities fell first and fell hardest, for it is in the cities that we press so close together, breath to breath and hand to hand, and the fungus loves nothing so much as a crowd. The great towers emptied, the hospitals overflowed and then went silent. The soldiers who were sent to hold the streets found that there was no line to hold, that the enemy was already inside the wire, already in the water, already in the blood of the people they had come to save. And then came the choices, the terrible arithmetic of the end, the decisions made in bunkers by frightened men who believed themselves to be saving what could still be saved. To stop the spread, whole cities were sealed, and then whole cities were burned, and the people trapped inside them, the well and the sick alike, the guilty and the innocent, the children and the old, were counted as an acceptable cost against the survival of the rest. Bombs fell on places that had names, that had schools and churches and libraries, and it did not matter, for the fungus did not care where the bombs fell, and by the time the frightened men understood that they could not burn the plague away, they had only added their own fires to the ruin. The order that had held the world together, the vast invisible web of it, the trucks that carried the food and the wires that carried the power and the laws that carried the peace, all of it came apart in the space of a single season. And what was left when the fires died down was a world of small frightened bands huddled in the dark and the endless patient dead. And out of that first great dying rose the thing that called itself FEDRA, the Federal Disaster Response Agency, the last hard remnant of a government that had otherwise ceased to exist. In the first days, it had been meant as a mercy, a body to shelter the survivors, to feed them, to hold back the infected and keep the last lights burning. But mercy, in a dying world, curdles quickly into control, and FEDRA learned, as the frightened always learn, that it is easier to rule by fear than by hope. It gathered the survivors into the quarantine zones, the walled cities we have already walked through, and within those walls it became a law unto itself, answering to no one, for there was no longer anyone left to answer to. It rationed the food, and so it held the power of life over every hungry soul. It tested for infection, and so it held the power of death, marking the sick for the burning pits, dragging away in the night anyone who coughed, anyone who fevered, anyone who was merely suspected. It hanged the smugglers and the dissenters in the public squares, and it told itself and told the people that this was the price of survival, that a boot upon the neck was better than a bite upon the throat. And perhaps it was. That is the hardest thing about FEDRA, that in its cruelty there was a kind of grim and terrible truth, that the order it kept, however brutal, was the only thing standing between the last survivors and the final dark. We would like the story to give us a villain here, a clear and hateful tyranny to set ourselves against. It will not. It gives us, instead, frightened people doing terrible things for reasons that are not wholly wrong, which is the harder and truer picture of how the world actually ends, and how it is actually held together in the aftermath, with cruelty and compromise, and the slow forgetting of who we once meant to be. But no boot presses forever without breeding the foot that kicks it off, and so, out of the misery of the quarantine zones, rose the Fireflies. They began as a dream, as most good and doomed things do, a dream dreamed by people who could not bear to believe that the world had come only to this, to walls and rationing and the endless watchful cruelty of the soldiers. They wanted the old world back, the votes and the voices and the freedom, the right of a people to choose the shape of their own lives, and they raised a banner against FEDRA and painted their slogan on the walls of every zone. "Look for the light," they wrote. "When you're lost in the dark, look for the light." And for a while, that light drew the hopeful and the brave from every corner of the ruined country. But a war against an army is a hard and grinding thing, and the years wore the Fireflies down, thinned them, hardened them, until the movement that had begun in hope had learned to live by the bomb and the bullet, until the line between the freedom fighter and the terrorist had worn away entirely, until many who had once looked to the light saw now only the blood on the hands that carried it. And through all their long defeat, the Fireflies held to one last hope above all the others, the hope that they might find, somewhere in the ruin, a way to cure the plague itself, for they understood that no rebellion, no matter how righteous, could ever truly win back the world while the fungus still ruled it. A cure, they believed, would be the light at the end of the longest dark, and they were still searching for it, still dying for it, on the day that a woman named Marlene laid eyes upon a child who could not be infected, and it is one of the story's quietest cruelties that when the cure at last came within their grasp, it was taken from them not by FEDRA, not by the Seraphites, not by any enemy at all, but by one grieving man who loved one girl more than he loved the whole of the world they had bled for. And let us dwell in this quiet a little deeper still upon the fungus itself, upon the strange and dreadful ecology of the world it had made. For it was not only in the bodies of the infected that the Cordyceps lived and ruled. In the deepest and darkest of the ruins, in the drowned subways and the collapsed basements and the sunless hearts of the old buildings, the fungus had spread beyond the bodies of its hosts and into the very fabric of the places themselves, growing up the walls in thick pale sheets, threading through the concrete, filling the still air with clouds of drifting spores. To breathe that air was death, and so the survivors learned to carry masks to seal their faces before they entered the dark places, for a single lungful of that golden drifting dust could carry the plague into the body as surely as any bite. And the dead, we come to understand, were never truly dead at all, for the fungus that had hollowed them out lived on within them and beneath them, binding corpse to corpse through long, pale threads that ran beneath the floors, so that the infected of a place were not separate creatures but limbs of a single spreading thing, one great and ancient organism dreaming its slow green dream in the dark, patient beyond all patience, waiting, growing, remembering nothing and wanting nothing and going on and on and on. It is a horror without a face and without a hate, and that is what makes it the truest horror of all, that the thing which ended the world was not evil, was not cruel, was not even aware, that it was only life itself, doing what life does, reaching and growing and filling every space it could reach, indifferent to the empires it drowned. And in the deepest ruins, where the spores drift thick and golden in the beams of a fallen light, one can almost feel it, the vast, slow patience of the thing, the sense of standing inside the body of a single enormous creature that has been dreaming here in the dark for 20 years, and will go on dreaming long after the last of us has gone. And so we come, at last, to Jackson, and to the fragile miracle of it. Tommy and his people cleared the infected from the valley. They mended the walls of the old town nearby. They planted crops and raised animals and posted patrols, and slowly, stubbornly, across the hard years, they made a place where a child could grow up without a ration card, where people danced on a Saturday night, where the word neighbor meant something again. Jackson was proof, small and flickering and precious, that the story of humanity need not end in the walled cruelty of the zones or the burning idealism of the Fireflies, that somewhere between the boot and the bomb there was still room, if only barely, for an ordinary human life. It was to this fragile proof that Joel would one day bring the daughter he had stolen from the world, and it was here, in the closest thing to peace that the ruined earth still offered, that the last and hardest chapter of their story would slowly, quietly begin. There is a warmth to Jackson that the story shows us, so that it can, in time, take it away. The lit windows on a snowy evening, the music from the town hall, the horses in the stable and the children in the school, and the sense, almost forgotten, of a community that plans for a future it expects to see. It is everything the whole long road was reaching toward. A home, a hearth, a life. And the story gives it to Joel and Ellie at last, this ordinary human happiness, and lets us settle into it, and lets us believe for a little while that they have finally, after everything, come to rest. And we should hold Jackson gently in our minds, for it is the story's one true answer to the darkness, the single place where the wheel of grief does not turn. Everywhere else we have walked, from the burning of the cities to the walls of Boston to the drowned war of Seattle, the story has shown us the same lesson written 100 ways, that fear builds walls, and walls breed cruelty, and cruelty breeds the war that fills the ruins with the dead. But Jackson is proof that it need not be so. Here the walls keep the infected out, and yet inside them the people have chosen, against every hard lesson the world has taught, to trust one another, to share, to raise children who dance, to be neighbors rather than hunters or hoarders or soldiers. It is small and it is fragile, and the story never pretends it is safe, for it will send its griefs riding into Jackson too before the end. But it stands there through the whole long dark as the thing that might have been, the road not taken by FEDRA and the Fireflies and the wolves and the Seraphites alike, the quiet, stubborn suggestion that the ending of the world did not have to mean the ending of one another, that even here, even now, even in the ruins, people could still simply choose to build a place where a child might grow up unafraid. The years turn once more, and we drift forward, 4 of them, 5, into a quieter time, or a time that wears the mask of quiet. Joel and Ellie made their way at last to Jackson, and there they stayed. There they tried, against all the weight of the ruined world, to make something that resembled a home. Joel built houses again, as he had in the world before, working the wood with his rough and capable hands, and Ellie grew from a girl into a young woman, into someone with friends, with a life, with a room of her own filled with drawings and old tapes and the small treasures of a person allowed at last to simply live. It was the closest thing to peace either of them had ever known. And peace, in this story, is only ever the held breath before the fall. For the lie still lay between them, buried but not gone, and over the years it had grown the way such things grow, into a quiet distance, a coldness Ellie could not name but could always feel. She had come in time to suspect the truth of what had happened in that hospital, to piece together from Joel's silences and Tommy's slips the shape of what her father had done, and when at last she made him confess it, made him admit that he had lied, that there had been a cure, that he had taken it from the world to keep her, something between them broke that could not easily be mended. She was furious with him, furious that he had stolen her choice, stolen the meaning she might have made of her survival, and yet she was bound to him still by all the miles and all the blood, and so they lived in the ruins of their love, close and estranged, a father and a daughter who no longer knew how to speak to one another, but could not bear to be apart. And this is the cruelest turn of the whole long story, that Joel's great act of love, the world traded for one life, poisoned the very bond it was meant to protect, that in saving her he had lost her, slowly, quietly, across the ordinary days. There is one mercy in it, though, and the story hides it carefully so that it can break our hearts with it later. For on the last night before the reckoning found him, Joel and Ellie had begun, at last, to speak. She had gone to him on his porch in the evening light and told him the truth of her heart, that she could not forgive him yet for the lie and the cure and the choice he stole from her, but that she wanted to, that she was willing to try, that she did not want to spend whatever years they had left as strangers under the same cold sky. It was not forgiveness. It was only the door to it, cracked open a finger's width after years sealed shut. But it was something, a beginning, a road they had finally set their feet upon together. And then the reckoning came and took him, before that road could be walked even a single step further, so that Joel died with the door only just ajar, and Ellie was left standing on the near side of it forever, holding an unfinished forgiveness that could now never be finished, a guilt that would drive her across a continent and very nearly to the bottom of a grey and freezing sea. And while they lived their fragile Jackson years, a reckoning was riding toward them from the west, born of the very blood that Joel had spilled in that hospital garage. For the surgeon Joel had killed, the doctor who stood over Ellie with the blade, had been a father too, and he had left behind a daughter, a girl named Abby, who had loved him as fiercely as Ellie loved Joel. Abby had grown up in the years since into a hardened soldier, a fighter of great strength and greater grief, and she had never stopped searching for the man who had murdered her father and stolen the cure and left the Fireflies broken in a bloody hospital. For years she hunted the rumor of him, followed the thin cold trail of a smuggler named Joel, until at last, in the deep of a Wyoming winter, the trail led her and her companions to the mountains near Jackson and to a patrol rider, caught in a blizzard, who told them, without knowing what he was giving away, that his name was Joel and that he could take them somewhere warm. Here is the terrible engineering of the story laid bare, the way that Joel's one act of love, the killing of the surgeon in the operating room, sent its consequence riding across 5 years and 1,000 miles to find him, the way that every death in this world is a father or a mother or a child to someone, the way that the blood Joel spilled to save his daughter became in time the blood that would take him from her. He did not know Abby's name. He had never seen her face, but he had made her in that garage, as surely as he had ever built anything with his hands, made an orphan, made an avenger, made the instrument of his own ending, and it had been riding toward him, patient as the fungus, all the long quiet years. What happened in that lodge is the wound from which the whole second half of the story bleeds, and it is a hard thing to drift through. So let us drift through it gently, the way one must speak of the worst things. Joel and Tommy, riding out to help a stranger caught in the storm, were led into the very heart of Abby's waiting people, and there, recognized, cornered, outnumbered, Joel was taken. And Abby, who had dreamed of this moment for years, who had built her whole life around the shape of this revenge, did not make it quick. She made him suffer, made him die slowly on the floor of that lodge. And the worst of it, the unbearable heart of it, was that Ellie came. Ellie, sensing something wrong, had ridden out after him, and she arrived in time not to save him, but only to see, to be held down and forced to watch, as the man who had carried her across a continent, who had called her baby girl, who had traded the whole world to keep her alive, was beaten to death on the ground before her, and the last words to pass between them were hard ones, unfinished ones, the words of two people who had not yet found their way back to one another, and now never would. Joel died estranged from the daughter he had saved, and Ellie was left alive with the very thing he had feared most for her, a grief with no bottom, and beneath the grief, rising, spreading, taking root the way the fungus takes root, a hunger for revenge that would consume her as surely as any infection consumes its host. And the story, which has taught us to love this man across 2 long journeys and 20 years, does not flinch, does not soften it, does not let him die well or quickly or at peace, but takes him from us on the floor of a stranger's lodge, in front of the child he loved, at the hands of another child whose father he took, so that we might feel, in full, the true and terrible weight of the wheel that is only now beginning to turn. And so Ellie set out for revenge, and the road she followed led west to the drowned and warring city of Seattle, where Abby and her people lived among the ruins. Ellie did not go alone. Dina went with her, a young woman of Jackson, whom Ellie had come to love in the tender new way that the surviving world still sometimes allowed. A love that might have been the beginning of a whole other life, a gentler life, had grief not called her onto the darker road. But Ellie could not let it go. The image of Joel dying on the lodge floor lived behind her eyes, and it drove her the way the fungus drives the ant, up and out and toward a bitter end, overriding every softer voice within her, every plea to turn back, to stay, to choose the life that love was offering her instead of the death that hatred demanded. This is the great and terrible symmetry of the whole story, that Ellie, hunting Abby to avenge a father, was walking the very same road that Abby had walked to avenge hers, that the wheel of vengeance turns and turns and grinds the same grief out of everyone it touches, and that revenge, like the infection, spreads from person to person, host to host, never healing, only making more of itself. Dina begged her, in 100 quiet ways, to see it, to feel the life that was there for the taking, the child she carried, the home they might make, the ordinary happiness that Jackson had almost taught them to believe in again. But Ellie could not hear it over the sound of the lodge floor, over the sound of Joel dying, over the guilt that she had let their last words be angry ones, that she had not forgiven him, that she had not been able to save the one person she had crossed a continent to keep. And so she went, west and down into the drowned city, carrying her grief like a torch, into a house already full of gunpowder. Let us drift before the ending, into the ruined city itself, into Seattle as it had become in the long years after the fall. For it was no empty tomb like Boston, but a place where a different kind of ruin had taken root, the ruin of two peoples at war. When FEDRA at last lost its grip upon that drowned northern city, driven out by a rebellion, the survivors who remained did not find peace in their freedom, but only a new and bloodier order. For into the vacuum rose a great and disciplined army that called itself the Washington Liberation Front, the Wolves, 1,000 strong, holding the ruins of the city with the salvaged weapons and the hard order of soldiers. They had freed themselves from one tyranny only to build another in its shape, ruling their fragile territory with patrols and checkpoints and an iron collective will. And it was among the wolves that Abby had made her life, a soldier among soldiers, respected, hardened, one small cog in the great grinding machine of their war. There is a bitter lesson in the wolves, the same lesson the Fireflies teach, the same lesson FEDRA teaches, that the ones who rise up against the boot so often become the boot, that the dream of freedom, once it has an army, curdles into just another order to be obeyed, that the survivors of this world, given power, build the very walls they once tore down, because walls, in the end, are the only thing anyone in this world has learned how to build. The wolves believed themselves the heroes of their own story, liberators, a people who had won their freedom with blood, and they were also just one more armed faction in a drowned city, making orphans holding ground, certain of their righteousness, exactly as certain as the enemy they hated across the water. For the wolves did not hold the city alone. Across the water, in the drowned islands and the forested hills, there lived their enemy, a people the wolves called the Scars, but who called themselves the Seraphites, a religious community grown up around the teachings of a prophet long dead, who marked their faces with ritual scars and moved through the trees in silence and killed with the bow and the blade rather than the gun. Between the wolves and the Seraphites, there ran a hatred as old and as deep as any in the ruined world. A war of raids and reprisals and hangings, each side certain of its own righteousness, each side making orphans of the other's children, an endless wheel of grief turning in the rain. The Seraphites had grown up, as such things do, out of the human need to make meaning of a meaningless catastrophe, to believe that the fall of the world was not simply a fungus and a stroke of chance, but a judgment, a cleansing, a message from something larger that watched and cared. They followed the memory of their prophet, a woman long dead whose words had hardened into law, and they whistled to one another through the trees in a language of bird calls, and they were, many of them, gentle in their way, devoted, communal, no crueler at heart than the wolves they fought. But faith in a hard world grows hard teeth, and the Seraphites had learned to cast out those who did not fit their pattern, to punish, to hang, to hunt their own, and it is from among them that the boy Lev will come, fleeing the very people who raised him, for the crime of being who he truly was. And it is in the sheltering of that cast-out child that the woman we have been taught to hate will find at last the beginning of her way back toward the light. And here we should linger, for the story is doing something quietly radical with these two warring peoples, refusing us the villain we keep reaching for. It would be so easy to hate the Seraphites, the arrow in the dark, the whistle in the trees, the strange faith that scars its own faces and hangs its own children. And it would be so easy to hate the wolves, the army, the checkpoint, the boot that replaced the boot it overthrew. But the story will not let us rest in either hatred, for it keeps turning them toward the light until we see the truth, that the Seraphite mother loves her child no less than the wolf mother loves hers, that the young zealot dying in the mud believed himself as righteous as the soldier who killed him, that there is no side in this war that is not, when you draw close enough to see its face, simply frightened people trying to keep their own alive in a world that has given them nothing but reasons to be afraid. Two peoples, mirror images, each certain the other is the darkness, each raising its children on the memory of the other's crimes, each feeding the same wheel that fed Ellie and fed Abby and fed Joel in the dirt of a Texas road. The oldest engine in the story, the one that runs on grief and pays out only in more of it, turning and turning in the drowned and rain-soaked city, making orphans faster than the fungus ever could. And into this drowned and warring city Ellie walked, alone in her purpose, a single grieving girl stepping into the crossfire of a war she did not understand and did not care to, for she had come only for Abby, only to close the wound that Joel's death had torn in her. Through the ruins of Seattle Ellie went, and she became across those 3 long days a thing she would not have recognized in the Jackson years, a hunter, a killer, methodical and merciless, following the trail of Abby's companions and cutting them down one by one. She tortured a woman named Nora for information, chased her into a spore-choked basement and broke her, and came away hollowed by it, sickened at what she was becoming and unable to stop. She killed a man named Owen and a woman named Mel, not knowing until it was done that Mel had been carrying a child, and the horror of it settled into her and would not leave. Every life she took brought her no closer to peace, only deeper into the dark, and the further she went, the more of herself she left behind, until the girl who had watched giraffes on a hillside was almost wholly buried beneath the thing that grief had made of her. And all the while she did not know, could not know, the truth that we, drifting above the story, are given to see, that the people she was killing were not monsters, that they had names and loves and reasons, that Abby's people were as human, as frightened, as grieving as her own. The story makes us watch it, the hollowing of Ellie, the slow spending of everything gentle in her upon a vengeance that feels nothing. And it is one of the hardest things it asks of us, to keep loving her while she becomes something terrible, to understand that the same grief that would break our hearts if we felt it is the very thing driving her hands, and that there is no clean line, none at all, between the wronged and the one who does the wrong. And the city itself would not let her pass untouched by its larger sorrow, for as she hunted her way through the ruins, she moved through the wreckage of that greater war, past the hanged bodies the Seraphites left for the wolves, and the burned villages the wolves left for the Seraphites, past the evidence on every side that the appetite for vengeance she carried in her own heart was only one small flame in a city that was burning with it. Every soul in Seattle was some other soul's Abby. Every killing was the answer to a killing before it. The whole drowned city was a single vast machine for the making and the answering of grief, turning in the rain, and Ellie walked through the heart of it, carrying her own small measure of the very poison that had drowned it, believing herself the wronged one, the righteous one, the exception, exactly as every hand that ever pulled a trigger in that city believed itself the exception. And the story sets her inside that machine so that we might understand, without a single word of preaching, that there is no exception, that the grief that feels so singular and so justified in our own chest is the same grief in every chest, and that a world where everyone is owed a death is a world that will never, ever stop paying. For the story does a strange and difficult thing here, a thing that made many who first heard it angry, and yet is perhaps the truest thing in it. It stops. It turns. It carries us away from Ellie entirely and sets us down inside the life of Abby, the very woman we have been taught to hate. And it asks us to understand her, to walk her road, to feel her grief as we felt Ellie's. And we learn that Abby is not a monster either, that she is a daughter who lost a father, that the killing of Joel gave her no peace but only a deeper emptiness, that in the years since she has been drifting, lost, as hollow as Ellie has become. And we learn that Abby, in the midst of her own hard war, had begun to find a reason to live again, in the shape of two children she was trying to protect, a boy named Lev and his sister, refugees from the fanatical faith across the water, cast out for the crime of being who they were. In caring for Lev, in choosing to shelter something small and vulnerable in a world that wanted it dead, Abby began slowly to become someone new, to climb up out of the pit that vengeance had dug for her, the very journey that Ellie could not yet make. Two women, mirror images, each the villain of the other's story, each only a grieving child who had loved a murdered father, and the story holds them up side by side and asks us the hardest question it knows how to ask. Which of them is right? And the answer it gives, gently, terribly, is that neither of them is, that there is no right to be had on the road of revenge, only more of the dead. And in the sheltering of Lev, in the risking of everything she had built among the wolves to carry that small life to safety, Abby does the thing that Ellie cannot yet do. She chooses a living child over a dead grievance. She chooses to build rather than to burn. And it is that choice, and not any victory in battle, that begins at last to heal the wound in her. Their two roads collided at last in a ruined theatre, where Abby, having learned that her friends were being hunted, tracked Ellie down and fell upon her, and the two grieving women very nearly killed each other there in the dark, among the rotting velvet seats. But Abby held her hand, seeing Dina, seeing that Ellie too had people she loved, Something in Abby refused to make another orphan of the world, and she let them live and walked away and told them never to follow, to go home, to let it end. And they might have. Ellie, wounded, hollowed, holding the woman she loved and the promise of a child to come, might have chosen at last to lay the weight down. But grief is a fungus with deep roots, and it does not release its host so easily as that. There is a mercy in the theatre, Abby's mercy, the first true crack of light in the whole dark second half of the story, the moment when one of the two grieving women looks at the other and sees, at last, not an enemy but a mirror, and chooses to let her live. It should have been the end. It could have been the end. Abby walks away, carrying Lev toward whatever future they can still make, having done the hardest thing, having stopped the wheel with her own 2 hands. But the wheel is not hers alone to stop, and Ellie, spared, still cannot let go of the thing that is eating her. And so the story, which offered us an ending, an off-ramp, a way home, watches quietly as one of its broken children turns away from the light one last time. We drift now to a farmhouse in the green hills far from the ruined cities, where for a little while it seemed that the story might, against all its own dark grain, allow a mercy. Ellie and Dina had left the killing behind and made a home there, a small and quiet place with sheep in the fields and a garden by the door, and, most precious of all, a child, Dina's baby, a small warm life to be protected and raised in whatever peace the world could still be made to offer. It was everything the whole long story had ever seemed to be reaching for. A family, a home, a future. Love chosen over vengeance at last. And Ellie could not hold it, for the grief still lived in her, the fungus in the mind, and it came for her in the night, in flashes of the lodge floor, in the sound of Joel's dying, in a guilt she could not name and could not lay down, that she had not forgiven him before he died, that she had let their last words be hard ones, that she had failed to save the one person she had crossed a continent to keep. And so, when word came at last of where Abby might be found, Ellie could not let it lie. She left the farm. She left Dina, who begged her to stay, who told her that if she walked out that door, she would not be welcome back. And Ellie walked out the door. It is perhaps the hardest thing in the whole story to watch, harder even than the lodge. This woman, who has been given the very thing the world spent 1,000 miles denying her, a home, a child, a love, a peace, sitting in the warm-lit kitchen of it all, and finding that the wound in her is louder than any of it, that she cannot hear the child crying over the sound of Joel dying, that she will trade the whole of it, all of it, everything, for one more chance at a vengeance she does not even truly want anymore, because the fungus in the mind does not care what we want. It only grows. Her road ran south this time, all the way to the coast of California, to Santa Barbara, where the last of Abby's trail led to a place of new horror, a stretch of ruined coast ruled by slavers who called themselves the Rattlers, men who had made a business of chaining the survivors they caught and working them to death. And there, in that place, Ellie found Abby again, but not the Abby she had come to kill, for the Rattlers had taken her, had chained her and starved her and hung her out to die on wooden posts along the beach, her and the boy Lev she had fought so hard to save. Ellie, arriving with murder in her heart, found her enemy reduced to a skeleton in chains, a broken thing more pitiable than hateful, and even then, even seeing her so, Ellie cut her down, for she needed Abby whole enough to fight, needed the reckoning she had come so far to claim. There is a bleak completeness to the Rattlers, the last faction the story shows us, for they are what is left when even the hard order of FEDRA and the burning faith of the Seraphites has rotted away entirely. Human beings reduced to nothing but appetite and chains, the final stage of the long unmaking, the bloater of factions, a thing that was once a society and is now only a mouth. Ellie freed Abby and Lev from the post, not out of mercy, but out of need, because a dead and starved Abby could give her nothing. And then, on the water's edge, in the shallows of the grey Pacific, she forced the fight she had crossed the whole ruined country to have. And it is worth sitting a moment with the horror of what Ellie has become by now. This girl we first met reading comic books by candlelight, humming half-remembered songs, achingly lonely and achingly alive. She has walked so far down the road of her grief that she can look upon her enemy strung up to die, starved to a skeleton, a broken and pitiable thing that has already suffered every torment she could have wished upon her, and feel not satisfaction, not release, but only a cold and hollow need to cut her down and revive her enough to be killed properly by Ellie's own hand, so that the ritual can be completed, so that the wound can be closed. That is what vengeance does, the story tells us, in this last and bleakest turn. It does not truly want justice, and it does not even, in the end, want the enemy to suffer. It wants only to keep feeding, to be answered, to complete its circuit, and it will drag its host past every off-ramp, past pity, past sense, past the very thing it claims to want, all the way down to a freezing sea at the bottom of the world, before it will ever let go. And it is here, in that final battle in the surf, that the whole long story of The Last of Us comes at last to its terrible and quiet point. Two broken women tore at each other in the water, drowning, bleeding, each too hollowed by grief to stop, and Ellie forced Abby under, held her beneath the waves, her fingers at Abby's throat. One moment from the vengeance she had sacrificed everything to reach. And in that moment, with Abby's life in her hands, Ellie saw Joel, not the dying Joel of the lodge floor, but Joel as he had been, on a porch in the evening light, and she remembered a thing she had almost forgotten, that on the last night before he died, she had gone to him and told him that she could not forgive him yet for what he had done, but that she wanted to try, that she wanted to find her way back to him. She had not finished that road before they took him, but she had started it. She had chosen, on that last night, to try to forgive. And remembering it, holding another woman's life beneath the water in a grief that had swallowed her whole, Ellie understood at last that this was not what Joel would have wanted, that killing Abby would not bring him back, would not undo the lodge floor, would not fill the hollow place, that revenge is a hunger that eats forever and is never fed, and she let go. She released Abby into the waves and let her live, let her take the boy Lev and go, and the wheel of vengeance, turning and turning across 2 lifetimes and 100 graves, came at last, on a grey beach at the end of the world, to a stop. 2 women who could have killed each other a dozen times over, walked out of the surf alive, one toward a boy who needed her, one toward nothing at all, and the great wheel that had crushed so many finally quietly ceased to turn, not because either of them won, but because one of them, at last, simply stopped pushing. But mercy, in this story, is never free, and Ellie's came too late to save the thing she had left behind. She made her way home at last, back to the green farmhouse in the hills, and she found it empty. Dana was gone. The child was gone. The home she had walked away from to chase a vengeance she did not even take was cold and still and hers no longer. She had traded it all, the love, the family, the fragile hard-won peace, for a killing she chose in the end not to commit, and she was left with nothing, alone in the empty rooms, the very thing she had feared most come fully upon her. And in the final image of the whole long saga, Ellie sat in that empty house and took up Joel's guitar, the instrument he had taught her to play, the last living thread between them, and she tried to play the song he had once played for her. But she could not, for in the fighting in the surf, Abby had bitten down on her hand and taken from her 2 of her fingers, and Ellie could no longer form the chords, could no longer make the music, could no longer reach even that last small echo of the man she had lost. She looked at the guitar a long moment, at the ruined hand that could no longer play it, and then she set it down, in the window, in the fading light, and she rose, and she walked out of the empty house, and out of the story, carrying her grief and her survival and the hard cost of both into a future we are not shown. A small figure walking away down an overgrown road, alive and free, and utterly alone. Let us drift a while away from the killing, back to the little town in the Wyoming cold, and rest there in the ordinary hours, for it is worth remembering that the world did not end everywhere at once, that in one small valley ringed by mountains, people were quietly relearning how to live. Jackson kept a rhythm, and the rhythm was its own soft armor against the dark. In the grey before dawn, the riders would gather at the gate, breath steaming, horses stamping, and go out 2 by 2 into the frozen country to walk the fence lines and clear the roads and watch the tree lines for the shapes that moved wrong. This was the patrol, the town's beating pulse, the thing that kept the wall meaningful, and every soul above a certain age took their turn at it, so that no one family carried the weight of the watching alone. There was a board in the town hall, a simple thing of pegs and paper, where the patrols were written out for the week, who rode with whom, which sectors, which days, and around that board the whole small society arranged itself. The married rode with the married, and the young rode with the young, and the old hands rode with the green ones, to teach them how to read a snowbank for the print of something dead. And in the evenings, the riders came home and hung their rifles by the door and went to the tavern, where someone always kept a fire, and there was music some nights, and dancing, and a kind of tired, ordinary joy that was, in its quiet way, the most defiant thing left in all the ruined world. For to dance, in a valley surrounded by the end of everything, is to say that the end has not won here, not yet, not tonight. They grew things in Jackson. They kept sheep and turned a great dam's old machinery until the lights came on in the windows after dark, a thing no other place in the story managed to hold. Children were born there who had never seen a city, never smelled the rot of a quarantine zone, who thought a horse was the ordinary way to cross the world, and a wall was simply where the world politely ended. And in the schoolroom, they learned their letters and, sometimes, learned to hold a rifle too, for the valley was gentle, but the country around it was not, and the town knew better than most that peace is a thing you build with your hands each morning and can lose in a single unwatched hour. It was on one of those ordinary patrols that the whole second half of the sad story turned, and it is worth understanding why the riding was dangerous even in a place so carefully kept, for the danger was never only the infected. A patrol in the deep snow was 2 people and 2 horses very far from any wall, and the cold could kill as surely as any clicker, and a storm could come down off the peaks and erase the road home in an hour, and the drifts could hide a fallen fence or a frozen creek, or a hole where a foot might break a horse's leg and leave 2 riders stranded in the killing white. So the pairs watched for each other as much as for the dead, and rode close, and marked their trails, and carried the small kit that might keep a body warm through a night in the open, and trusted, above all, the person beside them, for out there beyond the fence, a partner was the whole of your world. And this is why the town paired its riders so carefully, and why the losing of a partner cut so deep. For these were not soldiers under orders, but neighbors who had chosen each other, who knew each other's children, who would carry each other home dead across a saddle rather than leave one soul to the snow. The infected out in that country were fewer than in the cities, but stranger, for the long cold had done odd things to them, slowed some to frozen statues that thawed to sudden violence, driven others deeper into the abandoned lodges and mines where they waited in the dark. A rider learned to read the land like a language, to know that a certain silence meant clickers near, that birds gone from a stand of pines meant something moved there, that the safest looking cabin was often the one with a horror sleeping in its cellar. Every ride out was a small wager against all of it, and the town made that wager fresh each dawn, because the alternative, to stay forever behind the wall and never learn what pressed against it, was its own slower kind of death. There was a man in Jackson named Eugene, and though we never meet him alive, the story keeps a small, quiet room for him, and it is one of the tenderest corners in all the long tale. He had been one of the town's founders, an old firefly once, a rough and gentle man who kept bees and brewed strong drink and loved his wife with a plain devotion. And by the time the second story begins, he is already dead, of nothing more dramatic than age and a failing heart, which is its own small miracle in a world where almost no one is permitted to die of merely being old. But out beyond the wall, at the edge of a still lake, Eugene had kept a secret place, a little hidden refuge he had built for himself over the years, a room with a view of the water where he could sit and drink and watch the birds and be, for an afternoon, an ordinary old man in an ordinary world. And when Ellie and Dina, riding patrol, stumble upon it, the story lets them and us simply stand in it a while among his things, his bottles and his books and the weed he grew and the wall where he had written the small private jokes of a long marriage. There is a note there, and a view, and the sudden ache of a whole life lived and ended off the edges of the story we thought we were watching. It is a room that says the world is full of such rooms, full of people who loved and grew old and left small kindnesses behind, and that every wall we pass hides a life as whole and as grieved as any hero's. Ellie and Dina share a stolen sweet hour in that room, and it is one of the last unhaunted moments Ellie is given, a borrowed peace in a dead man's sanctuary, before the road takes everything. Now, let us cross the grey water to the other side of the Seattle War, to the ruined skyscrapers where a strange and silent faith kept its children, and meet the two who would matter most, a brother and a sister born into that faith and cast out of it for the crime of choosing their own souls. The sister was Yara, older, fierce and protective, and the brother was Lev, younger, quiet, grave beyond his years, and they had been raised among the Seraphites, the scar-faced people of the island, whose ways were harsh and whose mercy was thin. Lev had been promised, as their custom went, to a life he did not want, a marriage arranged for the good of the faith, and rather than kneel to it, he had taken up a razor and shaved his head, marking himself an apostate, refusing the shape the elders had cut for him. For that refusal, the two children were hunted by their own people, marked for death by the very mothers and elders who had raised them, and Yara paid for standing with her brother when a hammer came down on her arm and ruined it. And it is here that their road crosses Abby's, for Abby, herself lost and hollow and adrift in her own long grief, finds these two hunted children and, against every reason she has to leave them, chooses to help. In choosing Lev, in binding Yara's shattered arm and carrying them both through the war-torn city toward some faint hope of safety, Abby begins, without knowing it, to climb back toward being a person. For the children give her something that vengeance never could, a reason outside herself, a small life to shelter. Yara does not survive the crossing, and her loss is one of the story's quiet devastations. But in dying, she gives her brother to Abby's keeping, and Lev becomes the thread that pulls Abby up out of the pit, the living proof that even a soul soaked in violence can choose once to build instead of burn. And what of the drowned city itself, the great ruin of Seattle where so much of the grief plays out? For the story makes of it a character all its own, a place where the fungus had grown so deep and so long that it had become the very weather of the world. Rain fell there without end, and the water pooled in the broken streets and rose in the flooded subways. And in that warm, wet dark, the Cordyceps flourished, as it flourished nowhere else, climbing the walls of hospitals and hotels in great pale sheets, filling whole buildings with its breathing growth. There were places in that city a living lung could not go, rooms so thick with drifting spores that to enter without a mask was to invite the seed into your own blood, and the survivors had learned to read the fungus the way sailors read a coast, to know which doors led into death made visible. In the deepest of those places lived the worst of what the infection could become, the ones the story only whispers of, the shambling horrors grown so old inside the plague that they were more fungus now than flesh, their bodies split and sprouting, their movements a slow and dreadful patience. The city was a vast wet garden of them, tended by no one, growing toward no purpose, and through it the small warm bodies of the living crept and fought and bled over their little human wars, their factions and their vengeances, while all around them the true and patient master of the world went quietly on with its growing, indifferent to which of them killed which. There is a terrible irony the story lets us feel in that rain, that men had made of Seattle a battlefield, had bled and burned across it for faith and for territory, and for the ghosts of their murdered dead, and the fungus did not care at all, would inherit every inch of it in the end, would grow its pale gardens over the wolves and the scars alike, patient as the rain, patient as death, waiting for the last warm body to fall still. Through all of it, across every mile of the long descent, Ellie kept a journal, and it is worth resting a while in those pages, for they are the truest window we are ever given into the small, frightened soul behind the terrible things her hands were learning to do. She had carried the habit since her girlhood in the Boston school, this scratching of pencil on paper in the quiet hours, and into the little book went everything, the bad puns she loved and could not stop making, the drawings of things she saw, the moths and the birds, and the faces of the people she was learning to lose. It was a child's book, at the start, full of a lonely child's hunger for the world, and to read it is to remember that beneath the killer, she became there was always only a girl who wanted to know what the ocean smelled like and whether the stars had names. But the journal darkened as the road did. The puns grew fewer and the drawings grew stranger, and between the pages crept the fear she could not say aloud, the nightmares of the lodge, the guilt she could not name, the slow and dreadful knowledge that the thing she was chasing was eating her alive. She wrote of Dina, and of the child, and of the small farmhouse piece she could not make herself keep, and in the writing you can see her trying to talk herself into staying, into laying the weight down, and failing page after page, the way we all fail against the things that own us. The last pages are the hardest, for the hand that wrote them was steadier and colder than the hand that drew the moths, and something in the girl had gone quiet that would never quite wake again. And yet the journal remains, a small human record kept faithfully to the end, proof that even as the grief hollowed her, she never stopped trying to make sense of it, never stopped reaching, in pencil and in the dark, for the words that might have saved her, if only she had let herself believe them. Far to the south, on the sun-bleached ruin of the California coast, the story shows us the last and lowest thing that human beings become when every wall of decency has fallen, and it calls them the rattlers, and it makes of them a lesson in how the long unmaking ends. For the rattlers had built no faith and kept no law, and dreamed no dream of a better world, as even the harshest of the northern factions had once done. They had built only a business, and the business was people. They rode out along the drowned coast and took the survivors they found, the wanderers and the lost, and the small hopeful bands still looking for somewhere safe, and they chained them, and they marked them, and they worked them until the work killed them, and then they took more. It is a quiet horror, and the story lets it be quiet, for there is nothing grand in the rattlers, no thundering sermon, no father to avenge, only the flat and total reduction of a human life to a thing that can be used and used up. They had a compound of chained labour and a stretch of beach where they hung the used up and the troublesome out to die on wooden posts in the salt wind, a slow public dying meant to keep the others obedient. This is what the world becomes, the story tells us, when the fungus of the mind has finished its work, when grief and fear and appetite have burned away everything else, a place where the strong simply eat the weak and call it order. The northern factions were monstrous, but they were monstrous in the name of something, a faith, a homeland, a murdered friend. The rattlers are monstrous in the name of nothing at all, and that nothing is the true bottom of the story's long fall, the final stage of a sickness that began, long ago, with a spore in a field of grain, and ended here, on a beach of chains, with human beings keeping human beings as cattle beneath an indifferent sun. Before the beach, before the last unravelling, the story gives us one more small drowned sanctuary, and it is worth resting there a moment, for it shows us how even the hardest of the fighters longed, in secret, for an ordinary life. In the ruins of Seattle there was an aquarium by the water, and there Abby's oldest friend Owen had made a kind of hidden home, a place away from the endless war of the wolves, where the great dead tanks still held their painted fish, and the sound of the sea came soft through the broken glass. Owen was a soldier who had grown sick of soldiering, a man who dreamed aloud of leaving it all behind, of taking a boat and sailing south to find the rumour of a better place, of simply stopping, of laying the rifle down. It was a fragile dream, and the story does not let it live, for the aquarium becomes, in the terrible middle of the tale, a place of blood, where Ellie's road and Abby's cross in the worst of ways, and the small hope Owen carried, is snuffed out with him. But the story pauses there long enough for us to feel what was lost. Not a hero, not a villain, just a tired young man who wanted a boat and a horizon and a life without killing, and who dared, for a little while, in a room full of painted fish and dim green light, to imagine that he might yet be allowed one. His dream of the boat south echoes through everything that follows, the road not taken, the peace that every broken soul in the story reaches for, and so few are ever permitted to hold. And when we remember the aquarium, we remember that under all the factions and the vengeances, there were only ever people, wanting the same small, warm, ordinary things, and losing them one after another to the wheel that would not stop. And this we come to understand, drifting above it all in the quiet, is what the whole story has been trying to tell us, from the spore in the grain to the girl on the empty road. The fungus was never truly the monster, the infection that hollowed out the world, that turned men into puppets and cities into tombs, was only ever a thing without malice, a blind and patient growth, doing what growing things do. The real infection, the one the story returns to again and again, is the one that lives in us, in the love that will burn down the world to keep one heart beating, in the grief that drives us up and out toward vengeance, the way the Cordyceps drives the ant up the stem, in the hatred that spreads from person to person, host to host, orphan making orphan, forever. Joel loved Ellie so much that he doomed the world to save her, and in saving her he lost her, and in losing her he died estranged from the one soul he had given everything to keep. Ellie loved Joel so much that she followed his killer to the ends of the earth, and in the following she lost everything else she loved, and came home to an empty house, and could not even play his song. Abby loved her father so much that she crossed a continent to kill the man who took him, and found in the killing not peace but a deeper emptiness, and clawed her own way back toward the light only by learning, at last, to protect a child instead of avenge a ghost. Love and grief and vengeance in this world are the truest contagion of all, passing down the years from father to daughter to enemy to child, and no immunity has ever been found for them, and no cure was ever made. And yet, the story whispers, in its last and gentlest breath, there is a mercy even here, for a wheel that turns because we push it can also, if only we are brave enough to open our hands, be let go and stop. Thank you for drifting slowly through the timeline with me. If you've made it this far, into the quiet at the end of it all, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and which part of this long, sad story reached you most, whether it was the father in the Texas dirt, or the girl who could not play the song. Hit that button and stay with me for more deep dives into the lore that haunts the quiet hours, the stories that ache long after the screen goes dark. The infection has run its course. The world goes on without us, green and indifferent and lovely. And two women who could not forgive have walked their separate ways into whatever is left. Good night. Rest well, and remember, in a world that gives us so little, the ones we love are the whole of what we have, and the truest way to honor them is not to avenge them, but to lay the weight of our grief down gently at last, and to go on living, for their sake and for our own. This has been the complete timeline of The Last of Us. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never forget that some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. The story may be over, but its echoes will whisper in the quiet hours for generations to come.